Welcome back to Ottawa Today with Mark Sutcliffe on 1310 News and Rogers TV.
Elliot Tepper is with us every Wednesday on Ottawa Today to talk about the big stories in international politics. We've, of course, talked a lot about Donald Trump in the last year, and he's past 100 days now. Yes, I think it is worth noting that there were many people who said, oh, he'll get impeached in the first 60 days, or he'll quit, or there'll be some controversy, or the election will have been proven to be a fraud, whatever. The guy has made it, and I was never somebody who expected that he would not make it to 4 years, his health permitting. I'm not saying he's going to get reelected at this point. It's way too early to be guessing about that. But I always thought if Donald Trump's elected, he's going to be president for the next 4 years.
Yes, and he is campaigning right now for reelection.
Yeah.
He's running ads paid for by the reelection campaign to say what a great first 100 days I have. So
he's still running in the last election campaign in many ways, right? Still talking about Hillary Clinton, still talking about why the Democrats lost.
And by the way, James Comey, the FBI director, is going to be on the hot seat again today.
So at the Senate.
The Democrats may possibly raise the issue of, wait a minute, you said you don't comment about ongoing cases. You've been investigating the President of the United States since last August, but you raised it right in the middle of the campaign. And Hillary Clinton just said, I'd be president today if the election had been held on the 27th of October, which is when he made that blockbuster. So anyway, that's all domestic. Yes, we've talked, I think, already about the domestic side. And on one hand, you can argue he's been a great failure in his first 100 days. Once again today, they can't even get their act together. They have all the levers of power, the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and now the Supreme Court. They still can't get their keynote central planks through it all on immigration. The court said, hey, still looks to me like a Muslim ban. It's still unconstitutional. The health care, Obama, et cetera, et cetera. They've just Trump had to make huge compromises domestically to get the debt ceiling raised. The major domestic accomplishment is the government didn't shut down on the 100th day of his presidency, but he had to take some of his key things off, like paying for the wall. We've talked about that this can be viewed as a great shambolic, a word that isn't a word, an incredibly messy 100 days. But you can also argue, as I have, that it's also been a great success, and I'm not the only one. He does suit, too, because the Republican ascendancy is getting its agenda forward. The social conservatives are very, very happy. Lots is happening in terms of the environment, removing regulations, freeing up Wall Street, freeing up the energy companies. So a very successful run if you like the Republican point of view. But let's talk about foreign policy, because that's really more the focus of this.
Just before we do, I think there is also the advantage you have as somebody who is anti-establishment, that it's almost impossible to lose in the early going of a presidency or an administration. Because on the one hand, if you get things done, you've succeeded. If you don't get things done, you're still the guy who's in there fighting against all the prevailing currents that you were fighting against in the campaign.
And the only polling we have, and we've talked about it on air, shows that the Republican base is very happy with him.
Yeah.
And what we could call the Trump base, which is an overlapping but not identical base, because he got a lot of Democratic working class votes. They're all happy with him, and only 2% would change their mind at this point. So the people that brought him there could bring him there again, and we've talked about that. But on foreign policy, we have less to work with. And, of course, foreign policy, normally there's more continuity than discontinuity, no matter how disruptive they say they're going to be. And are we seeing the education of Donald Trump when it comes to foreign policy? We have a couple of case studies recently, and that affects us in particular, in terms of NAFTA. How do we judge the foreign policy of Donald Trump after 100 days? And the first case study we have is indeed NAFTA, because on the one hand, it looks just like he's doing the art of the deal. So the question one, are we seeing the art of the deal when it comes to NAFTA? Remember, we sent very effective lobbying teams down to Washington, we meaning the government of Canada, not you and I, but Canada has really handled its cards as best you could with the incoming Trump administration and since the inauguration. But suddenly, out of the blue, we have, I have right here a quote. How's he doing? this is Donald Trump. Crucially, to bring back our jobs, we are going to pursue a complete renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement. We've lost nearly a third of our manufacturing jobs in 23 years, etc. We heard, and it was on just before the 100 days, that he was going to rip up NAFTA. And it was all in the works. So this was released. But then he didn't. He said, so what are we seeing here, the art of the deal? The art of the deal is you announce you're going to rip it up, then you graciously say no after talking to Trudeau and the president of Mexico. And gosh, I didn't know they were going to lose jobs in Canada. So we'll renegotiate. But this is just the art of the deal. You soften up the opposition, and then you're at the day one of renegotiation. You're in the catbird seat, which they are anyway, given the size of their economy. But that seems to be the art of the deal. Or, alternatively, are we seeing a foreign policy built on my lobbyists are better than your lobbyists, and who talked to me most recently? And the investigation shows it's the latter. That is, it wasn't he actually did plan. Peter Navarro, the head of his trade council, has said, and apparently Bannon as well, we hear whispers, said, you're coming up to 100 days, you've got nothing, rip up NAFTA. It'll make the base happy. Right. And he didn't because he started hearing from corporate America, and he started hearing from, interestingly, Jared Kushner. So Canada had very effectively reached Jared Kushner and Ivanka right after the Trump election, and all of the lobbying of the northern states, so the federal system of America, Congress, the corporate sector. And at the last minute, he said, no, maybe I won't rip it up after all. I will listen. And when our prime minister was on the phone with the president of the United States to talk about this, on the phone on an extension was not Peter Navarro, the head of the Trade Council, but Jared Kushner. So very interestingly, what it appears to be, when it comes to NAFTA, which affects Canada so severely, it's not a question of carefully thought out strategy, carefully executed on the Trump administration side, but rather the effectiveness of Canada's lobbying over a period of time in corporate America and the upper tier northern states saying, hey, look, don't do this. So what does that tell us about foreign policy? Well, it doesn't show strategy in depth. It doesn't show coherence. It does show there's room for maneuver, working to our advantage right now. But as a foreign policy, we don't know.
What about the much scrutinized comments that Donald Trump has been making about other world leaders, including the leader of the Philippines, the leader of North Korea? People have been criticizing Trump because he's been talking about them in flattering terms, saying he'd be honored to meet some of these people. How do you see that playing out?
Well, we've talked earlier in the previous administration, both in Canada and the United States, about having a Council of Democracies, because after all, the Council of Democracies, with the UN not showing any signs of vitality, there has to be leadership someplace, and there actually is a Council of Democracies. Now you begin to wonder, is Donald Trump putting together a council of autocrats and autocracies? Because quite clearly, he is very friendly to strong leaders. Duterte, I mean, really. But let's talk about two in particular, and that's Xi Jinping and the one you mentioned. I would be honored to talk to Kim Jong-un.
Yeah.
I've got his father and his son and the grandson involved. So I think you could say this is very smart tactics. It's tactics. That is, what we see right now is the most dangerous situation perhaps since the Cuban Missile Crisis with Donald Trump. And this is, I think, we're talking about his foreign policy after 100 days. Donald Trump has a red line. He has chosen, as a matter of foreign policy choice, to draw a red line over the North Korea's advance toward being a nuclear breakout state. It's a little unclear what the red line is. Missile launches, another nuclear what would happen if they cross the line? But what we see is a power play. America does have their armada in place. Finally, they know where their carrier actually is located, and so they're putting pressure on North Korea and pressure on China. And they've done something I think quite clever in terms of China. They've said to China, "Look, we respect you. You're being disrespected by North Korea, and we respect you. So you should really act." So this is saving face, in effect, and motivating China to act in terms of North Korea. And calling the North Korean leader, I'd be honored. That, too, could be considered a clever idea, because then he might actually open up a diplomatic way out of the current crisis. But I have to stand back and ask, is this a tactic? Or is it a strategy that has defined goals and a defined end point? And right now, the Trump foreign policy is making the allies of America just as nervous as those who are on the sharp end of the stick. Japan and South Korea have every reason to be as nervous as North Korea and China. What would happen if this gamble, if this hope, if this tactic doesn't work?
I suspect we'll be talking a lot about that in the weeks ahead. Elliot, thank you.
You're very welcome. I look forward always to these conversations.
See you next week. Elliot Tepper from Carleton University.